I want you to imagine for a second um, an organ so culturally powerful that entire civilizations have built myths, religions, and literal identities around it.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a single organ that has been treated as like a symbol of divine creation.
Right, an emblem of immortal strength.
Yeah.
But what if the cultural symbol of masculinity hides a far more fragile biological system underneath?
It's the ultimate paradox, really. You have this massive, unyielding cultural edifice resting on a foundation of extremely delicate tissue.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. This deep dive explores a really fascinating piece of source material. It's called Manhood, The Rise and Fall of the Penis by urologist Mels van Driel.
And, we're using his work today to examine how biology, culture, and institutions interact to construct the idea of manhood.
Exactly. Because rather than treating masculinity as just this stable identity or a purely cultural invention, Van Driel's work reveals this incredibly complex system.
Right, a system where reproductive biology, symbolic meaning, psychological pressure, and modern medical technology all reinforce one another.
And the biological system at the center of this whole story is, of course, the male reproductive system itself.
Right, so we're talking about the testes, the hormones, sperm production, and the really delicate vascular mechanisms that actually produce erections.
Which, as we'll get into, evolution shaped through some pretty wild processes like sperm competition.
Yeah, where reproductive success favored traits that increase the absolute probability of fertilization.
So you've got testosterone regulating development and fertility, while organs like the epididymis, the prostate, and the scrotum coordinate the whole, production and delivery of sperm.
But biological systems rarely exist in isolation, right? Across basically all cultures and religions, the phallus emerged as this incredibly powerful symbolic object.
Representing fertility, vitality, and even immortality.
Exactly. Ancient myths, religious rituals, they all elevated the erect penis into a symbol of divine or masculine power.
And over time, this symbolic system shifted all the attention away from the testicles, which are the actual biological source of fertility, toward the penis as a cultural icon of strength and performance.
And that shift is what produced this really intense structural tension between biology and symbolism, because biologically, erections are these fragile neurovascular events.
Right, they depend on the relaxation of smooth muscle tissue, blood flow, hormonal balance.
But psychologically and culturally, the penis became a symbol that was expected to perform reliably as proof of masculinity.
And the incentive architecture surrounding this system just reinforces that tension, right? Male identity becomes completely tied to performance.
Which creates these psychological feedback loops where anxiety can directly disrupt the actual physiological mechanisms required for an erection.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Cultural expectations generate biological failure, which then deepens the psychological pressure.
And then institutional systems amplify the whole dynamic. I mean, modern medicine totally transformed urology from a basic surgical discipline into a high-technology reproductive industry.
Right? Addressing infertility, erectile dysfunction, age-related hormonal decline.
And you have technologies like ICSI intracytoplasmic sperm injection, which allows a single sperm cell to fertilize an egg, bypassing natural selection entirely.
Which is amazing because these innovations solve very real medical problems, yet they also expand the system by medicalizing aspects of aging and performance that were once just considered, natural biological variation.
The outcomes of this system appear literally everywhere. You see anxiety surrounding sexual performance, entire industries dedicated to enhancing masculinity.
And persistent cultural myths about sexual anatomy.
Yeah, and these outcomes persist not because individuals just misunderstand biology, but because the system itself intertwines evolutionary drives, cultural symbolism, psychological identity, and institutional incentives.
It reveals a much deeper interconnection. Human reproduction links biology to identity, identity to culture, and culture to institutions.
And when any one layer is examined in isolation, whether it's purely biological or purely social, the underlying system just becomes invisible.
So what is the crisis in perception here?
Well, the crisis lies in confusing a cultural symbol with a biological system. The phallus is treated as an emblem of strength, permanence, and control.
While the actual biological structures that sustain reproduction are fragile, hormonally regulated, and deeply vulnerable to stress and aging.
Exactly. When perception focuses on symbolic performance rather than systemic reality, misunderstanding becomes completely inevitable.
Systems analysis reveals that manhood is not simply a trait or an identity. It is an emergent property of interacting biological, psychological, cultural, and institutional systems.
Each one reinforcing expectations that the others cannot reliably sustain.
So that's the framework for today. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
And if you've ever considered how the pressure to perform, whether in a boardroom or a bedroom, is shaped by thousands of years of evolutionary biology crashing into cultural mythology, this is the deep dive for you.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand how we got here, we have to start with the words we use. The history of the language here it's honestly mind-blowing.
It really is. Because language is basically the operating system of perception, right? How ancient cultures named these biological structures tells us exactly how they valued them.
So let's look at the testicles. For most of human history, the physical seed, the testicle, was the undisputed king of this whole biological system.
Right, it was the literal root of life.
And if we look at Latin, the word for testicle is testis, which, when you trace the etymology, translates literally to witness.
Witness, yeah. And that is not just some quirky linguistic coincidence. It shares a direct root with words like testify or testament.
Right.
In ancient Roman legal and cultural frameworks, swearing an oath was a deeply physical, deeply consequential act. You didn't just, put your hand on a religious text.
You placed your hand on your own testicles, or sometimes the testicles of the person you were swearing fealty to, which, just picture that happening in a modern courtroom. It's wild. But the source material actually brings up the book of Genesis to illustrate how widespread this practice was in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, the story of Abraham.
Right. Abraham asks his servant to swear a sacred oath by placing his hand, quote, under his thigh. And historians and etymologists universally understand that phrase to be a polite euphemism for the testicles.
Because the underlying logic is incredibly profound when you think about it. By swearing on the testes, the witness, you are essentially putting your entire genetic future up as collateral.
Wow. Yeah, you're swearing on your unborn kids.
Exactly. You're swearing on the lives of your descendants. The ancients fundamentally understood that the factory of life, the mechanism of generational continuity, was housed right there in the scrotum.
It anchored the whole concept of manhood in something really tangible and generative. Not just performance, but actual creation.
Right. It's a very grounded way to view the human body.
But then if we pivot over to the ancient Greeks, their approach was a bit more visually imaginative, let's say. Because the Greek word for testicle is orchis, which is the exact root of the word for the orchid flower.
Yes, the orchid. And this is where human psychology starts blending observation with just total superstition, because the tubers of the orchid plant bear a remarkable, undeniable visual resemblance to human testicles.
They really do.
But in the ancient and medieval mind, that visual similarity wasn't just like a funny coincidence. It was interpreted as a hidden code written by nature.
It's like sympathetic magic, right? The idea that if two things look alike, they must share some sort of metaphysical connection.
Exactly that. And this belief system bled directly into actual dietary habits for centuries.
Well, they actually ate them.
Oh, absolutely. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was a widespread, earnest belief that if a man went out and foraged the largest, most robust orchid tubers he could find and incorporated them into his diet, he would magically sire particularly large, robust children.
That is, the logic is just so flawed.
Well, the shape of the food was thought to directly enhance the function of the corresponding organ. It's sympathetic magic at its finest.
So for thousands of years, across different empires and languages, the testicles were revered as the absolute center of gravity for male identity and fertility. But then, as society began to industrialize, the focus of sex slowly began to decouple from strict procreation.
Right. The conversation drifted toward pleasure.
And as that happened, the anatomical spotlight had to shift. And Sigmund Freud was the one who officially grabbed that spotlight and pointed it somewhere else.
Yeah, Freud executed what Van Driel effectively described as a conceptual coup. He completely rewired the psychological architecture of the 20th century.
Because Freud popularized the concept of castration anxiety, right?
What?
Which is a psychological framework that still totally haunts cultural discourse today.
Right. But here is the critical historical divergence that Van Driel points out. For thousands of years prior to Freud, castration universally meant one specific biological act, the removal of the testicles.
Yeah, you remove the source of the seed, you remove the hormones, you shut down the factory.
Exactly. But Freud changed the definition. When Freud spoke of castration in his psychoanalytic theories, he used the term to denote the removal of the penis.
He effectively just deleted the testicles from the psychological equation of manhood entirely.
He really did. He shifted the entire cultural focus away from the biological factory of fertility and placed it squarely onto the delivery mechanism, elevating the penis to the symbolic status of the phallus.
And why did this happen? It mirrors that broader cultural transition you mentioned earlier. As pleasure and performative dominance became the primary focus of sexual discourse, the penis usurped the testicles as the defining center of masculinity.
And it's not like the ancients had the biology right either. I mean, we can look back and see how cultural bias completely blinded them to empirical reality. Oh, yeah. Even when they were revering the testicles, their science was basically just philosophical guesswork designed to uphold male supremacy. I mean, Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, genuinely believed that semen was manufactured in the brain.
In the brain, right.
And then it traveled all the way down the spinal cord to be delivered, which is just anatomically hilarious.
And Aristotle took it a step further into the realm of pure philosophy. Aristotle proposed an idea called hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism. Okay, what is that?
Well, in his view of reproduction, the man provided the eidos, the form, the blueprint, the actual soul of the child.
Okay.
The woman, according to Aristotle, contributed absolutely no life force. She merely provided the transformed matter, which he believed was essentially just coagulated menstrual blood.
Wow.
He viewed women essentially as passive incubators, or, as he notoriously put it, incapacitated men.
Which is just a staggering leap of logic to justify a patriarchy. It's like assuming the person who turns the key in the ignition is the one who actually built the entire engine from scratch out of nothing. Right, it completely ignores the machinery.
Because we know now, definitively, that the female ovum actually provides more than half the necessary genetic information, including all the mitochondrial DNA that powers the cells. But Aristotle's blind guess cemented this idea of male biological supremacy for nearly 2 millennia.
It demonstrates how deeply our institutions, even early science and philosophy, are willing to contort reality to uphold a cultural narrative of male dominance.
But while philosophers were debating souls and spinal fluid, there was an invisible, brutal force quietly shaping the actual architecture of the male reproductive system behind the scenes.
Evolution.
Evolution. And the evolutionary reality is so much stranger and more complex than the mythology. What's fascinating here is how the biological system actually developed.
It really is, because to understand the actual biological system, we have to talk about sperm competition. Evolution shaped these structures not to fit some human concept of dignity, but to win a microscopic race.
Right.
The easiest way to see this is by looking at our closest primate relatives.
Okay, so let's compare gorillas to chimpanzees. Because if you look at a silverback gorilla, the male is an absolute titan. Massive body mass, incredible physical dominance.
Huge.
Animals. But biologically, his testicles are incredibly small relative to his body size.
Because he doesn't need them to be big. A silverback gorilla enforces his reproductive monopoly through pure physical violence and intimidation.
Right, he fights off other males.
Exactly. He fights off other males to maintain an exclusive harem of females. And because no other male is mating with those females, there is no biological race happening inside the female reproductive tract.
Oh, wow.
His sperm doesn't have to outswim a competitor's sperm because there are no competitors. Therefore, evolution doesn't waste precious metabolic energy building massive sperm factories.
That makes total sense. But then you look at chimpanzees and human beings, and our testicles are comparatively huge.
Exactly. Large testicles point to an evolutionary past characterized by multi-male mating systems.
Yeah.
In a scenario where multiple males might mate with the same female within a short time frame, physical dominance on the outside is no longer enough. The competition moves from the jungle floor down to the microscopic level.
Right.
The male who can ejaculate the largest volume of highly mobile, vigorous sperm cells, essentially flooding the zone, has the highest statistical probability of his genetic material reaching the ovum first.
It is quite literally a biological arms race.
And evolutionary arms races produce some absolute biological wildcards. I mean, nature doesn't care about elegance at all. It only cares about what works.
And the source material brings up a great example of this, the Argentine duck, which completely shatters any conventional idea of anatomy.
Oh, the duck, yeah.
This specific duck has a corkscrew-shaped penis that, when fully erect, can be up to 43 centimeters long.
Which is longer than the duck's entire body.
That's insane.
Yeah.
But why does it look like that?
Well, it is a phenomenal example of evolutionary antagonism. That 43-centimeter corkscrew evolved specifically to navigate the incredibly complex maze-like reproductive tract of the female duck.
A maze.
Yes, the female evolved a labyrinthine vaginal canal with false dead ends and reverse spirals to maintain control over which male actually fertilizes her eggs.
Wow. So she's actively filtering them out.
Exactly. And in response, the male evolved a highly specialized explosive delivery system to bypass her defenses.
It's biological extremism. Or, look at the male drone bee. Its genitals literally act as a mating plug.
Right.
The drone mates with the queen, and its anatomy snaps off, blocking the reproductive tract to prevent any subsequent males from mating with her. But deploying that plug costs the drone its life. It literally explodes and dies just to win the reproductive race.
Which highlights a crucial philosophical point for you, the listener, to absorb. Evolution does not care about the individual's comfort, dignity, or psychological well-being. It only cares about the successful transmission of genetic material.
The systems are designed for microscopic efficacy, not cultural pride.
Exactly. And this brings us to the mechanics of the human erection itself, which is perhaps the most deeply misunderstood biological process in our entire anatomy.
This part of the book really blew my mind, because the cultural myth, the narrative we are all fed, is that the penis must be active to be erect. The language we use implies tension, flexing, and power.
But the physiological reality is the exact opposite. It is an incredibly fragile, complex neurovascular event.
So how does it actually work?
Let's break down the actual tissue. The internal structure, the corpora cavernosa, is essentially a spongiform network made of smooth muscle cells and blood vessels.
Okay, like a sponge.
Right. When the penis is flaccid, those smooth muscle cells are not resting. They are actually contracted. They're working hard, staying tense, heavily influenced by norepinephrine almost all day long to squeeze the blood vessels shut and keep the blood out.
Wait, really? So the baseline state of the organ is tension. The flaccid state takes energy?
Yes. To achieve an erection, an entirely different neurological pathway has to take over. The brain must send signals, releasing nitric oxide, which commands those smooth muscles to actually relax.
Oh.
When they finally let go and relax, the arteries dilate, allowing the spongiform network to rapidly fill with blood. And as that tissue expands, it physically compresses the veins against the tough outer sheath of the penis, trapping the blood inside.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's not like flexing a bicep to show strength, right? It's actually like releasing a tightly wound spring or unkinking a garden hose.
Yes, perfect analogy.
The physical effort, the constant energy expenditure, is in staying soft. Getting hard requires biological surrender. It requires a profound systemic relaxation of the tissue.
And that biological fragility, that vulnerability extends to the testicles as well. We discussed their role in the evolutionary arms race, but their placement is a structural anomaly.
Because they're on the outside.
Right. There's a reason they are located outside the protective cavity of the body, dangling in what urologists often refer to as the cool box.
Right, because sperm production is incredibly temperamental when it comes to heat.
Precisely. Human spermatogenesis requires a temperature slightly lower than our core body temperature, usually around 33 to 34 degrees Celsius.
Which is why they hang away from the core.
Yes. And to achieve this, the body evolved a brilliant, highly delicate countercurrent heat exchange system called the plexus pampiniformis.
The plexus what?
Plexus pampiniformis. It's a network of veins carrying cool blood back up from the exposed testicles, and this network tightly wraps around the artery, bringing warm blood down from the abdomen.
Oh, that's clever.
By intertwining them, the cool venous blood absorbs the heat from the arterial blood, effectively cooling it before it ever reaches the delicate sperm factories.
The temperature control mechanism makes perfect sense for humans and many other mammals. But I have to push back on this being the universal defining rule. Well, what about animals whose testicles are completely internal, like elephants or dolphins? Their core body temperature is just as high, yet their sperm production works perfectly fine deep inside their abdomens. If temperature is the absolute non-negotiable rule of biology, how do they survive? There has to be another evolutionary variable at play here.
That is a brilliant observation, and it actually points to a major debate in evolutionary biology. You're referring to the movement theory, sometimes called the galloping hypothesis.
Okay, the galloping hypothesis.
Some biologists argue that the cool box effect is actually a secondary benefit, and the primary reason for external testicles has to do with locomotion.
Because an elephant glides, essentially, and moves smoothly.
Exactly. Animals with fluid gliding movements, like dolphins swimming or elephants with their deeply cushioned rolling gaits, have internal testicles. But animals that run, jump, jolt, and bump violently across the savanna, like gazelles, horses, and early hominids, benefit from having their reproductive organs suspended externally.
Oh, I see. It acts as a shock absorber.
Right. By allowing the organs to swing independently of the core body's violent impacts, they protect the fragile tissue from internal bruising against the pelvic bones during a sprint.
Wow. So the more we look at the actual biological system, the more we see a structure defined entirely by vulnerability, temperature sensitivity, the absolute necessity of relaxation, and a microscopic competition that totally ignores the individual's dignity.
Exactly.
Which leads us directly into the heart of this deep dive. If the biological reality of this system is based on surrender and fragility, how on earth did we end up with a cultural symbol that represents rigid, conscious, unyielding, permanent power?
That is the core of the crisis in perception. We have conflated the biological penis with the symbolic phallus. They are not the same thing.
Right.
The penis is a piece of mortal anatomy. It is completely unpredictable. It depends on a perfect, harmonious, highly fragile alignment of hormones, blood flow, neurological signals, and most importantly, a calm mental state.
And the phallus is the exact opposite.
The phallus is a cultural icon. It represents immortality, vitality, divine creation, and unfailing conscious power. It does not bleed, it does not age, and it does not fail.
And you see the construction of this immortal symbol everywhere in the ancient world. It is the foundational pillar of human mythology. Look at Egyptian mythology, for example. You have the primeval creator god, Adam.
Right, the Heliopolitan creation myth.
Yeah. In that myth, Adam literally masturbates the universe into existence. The act of bringing order to the cosmos, of creating life from the void, is tied inextricably to this concept of unfailing divine phallic power.
And we see it erupting into public life in ancient Greece, too. During the Dionysian festivals, citizens would parade through the streets carrying giant carved wooden phallus poles, literally singing hymns to it. It was a celebration of the raw, generative force of nature.
But it wasn't just reserved for wild festivals. It was woven deeply into the mundane, everyday civic life of the Greeks. They constructed statues called herms.
Ah, yes, the herms.
These were essentially square stone pillars with the carved head of the god Hermes on top and an erect penis protruding from the front of the pillar. And they were everywhere. They placed them outside their homes to ward off evil, at the gates of the city, at crossroads, in the markets.
And they were objects of deeply public, casual worship. Citizens walking by would pour olive oil on the phallus to anoint it. They would wreathe the herms in fresh greens.
And they would routinely touch the stone phallus for good luck, fertility, or just protection on a journey.
Which feels so profoundly alien to us now, right? The idea of totally public, unashamed reverence for genitalia.
Oh, completely. But Van Driel makes a brilliant point in the source material. We actually still have echoes of this exact behavior today.
We really do.
The instinct hasn't vanished. It's just been driven underground by modern superstition and, prudishness.
He uses a fantastic example from Italy.
Yes. If you go to the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, there is a famous fountain surrounded by these beautiful bronze statues of mythological fauns.
Right.
Because they've been sitting outside for centuries, the bronze is heavily oxidized. The statues are covered in a dull, dark green patina, except for one specific area.
The penises of the fauns are polished to a bright, gleaming gold.
Exactly. Why? Because thousands of modern tourists walk by every day and secretly stroke the bronze, hoping for a bit of luck or fertility.
We went from public, civic worship of the herms to a secretive, almost embarrassed superstition, but the heavy symbolic weight of the phallus is still perfectly intact.
Yet, and this is a crucial distinction that modern society has completely lost. The ancient Greeks themselves understood the difference between the divine symbol and the mortal man.
Yes, that firewall they had.
Right. They worshipped the giant stone phallus as an abstract concept of natural power, but they did not expect actual human men to look or act like the statues.
In fact, their aesthetic preference for actual human anatomy was the complete inverse of modern expectations.
The inverse? How so?
Well, ancient Greek aesthetics, which you can see in all of their classical sculpture, heavily preferred a small anatomical penis on a man.
A small one.
Yes. To the Greek philosophical mind, small genitalia represented rationality, civilization, stoicism, and control over one's base animal urges.
Interesting.
They associated large genitalia with barbarism, lack of control, and mythical half-beasts like satyrs.
It was so ingrained that displaying the glands of the penis in public was considered highly vulgar and offensive.
Even during the Olympics.
Right. During the Olympic Games, the athletes competed entirely naked. But to maintain their dignity and adhere to the cultural aesthetic of restraint, they would use a specific piece of equipment called a kynodismy.
Echinotismy.
It was a thin leather ribbon tied tightly around the foreskin, pulling it forward to completely conceal the glands and tie the anatomy up against the body.
They revered the phallus as a divine, uncontrollable force of nature, but they expected the mortal man to exhibit modesty, restraint, and philosophical control over his own flesh. They kept the biological system and the cultural symbol separated by a firewall of philosophy.
But over the centuries, we systematically tore that firewall down. We merged the two concepts. We started expecting the mortal, flesh and blood penis, which relies entirely on neurological relaxation, to behave exactly like the immortal, unyielding stone phallus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a society adopts the immortal phallus as the standard for literal everyday manhood, it creates an impossible incentive architecture.
Right.
You are asking human men to biologically embody a mythical concept.
Yeah.
You are demanding that a fragile vascular system, which requires total neurological surrender and relaxation to function, perform on command as a demonstration of conscious, dominant power.
It is a structural contradiction that just cannot be sustained.
And that impossible expectation doesn't just sit politely in the realm of art history or cultural theory. It violently crashes into human psychology. It creates an absolutely destructive feedback loop in the mind.
Because when the physical body inevitably fails to live up to the immortal symbol, the psychological toll is immense.
This is where we have to reevaluate how we view erectile dysfunction, or ED. The medical establishment often treats it merely as a mechanical failure of the plumbing.
Right, a broken pipe.
But viewing it that way completely misses the systemic reality. It is, first and foremost, a profound psychological crisis. As Van Driel poignantly describes it, it is the terrifying moment when the well-trained dog suddenly refuses to obey its master's commands.
The historical accounts of this psychological crash are deeply tragic. The 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote a remarkably candid essay detailing the story of a nobleman from Gascony.
This story is brutal.
It really is. This man was with a woman he doubly desired, but in the crucial moment, his biology failed to respond. He couldn't maintain an erection.
And in a culture where manhood is synonymous with phallic performance, that singular failure completely shattered his identity.
The shame and the sheer terror of that one failure completely consumed him. He became so intensely obsessed with the fear that it would happen again that his anxiety became a paralyzing agent.
He became genuinely, completely impotent.
The fear of the failure caused the failure. Ultimately, the psychological torment of feeling utterly stripped of his manhood was so overwhelming that he went home and physically amputated his own penis.
It is a horrific, visceral story, but it perfectly illustrates the lethal weight of the cultural symbol. When the biology fails the myth, the mind turns against the body.
And this psychological manifestation of cultural anxiety isn't limited to a few isolated historical anecdotes either. The source material details a fascinating, terrifying psychiatric condition called Coro syndrome.
This is a condition predominantly found in Southeast Asia, but Van Driel makes it clear that the underlying psychological mechanism absolutely exists in the West, too.
So what exactly is Coro?
Coro is a severe acute psychiatric syndrome where a man becomes genuinely, overwhelmingly convinced that his penis is physically shrinking. He believes it is slowly retracting into his abdomen and that once it fully disappears inside his body, he will die.
Wow.
It is an absolute existential panic attack centered entirely on the loss of the phallus.
And the text mentions a highly specific case of an American man in his 50s to prove this isn't just a regional phenomenon. This man rushed into an emergency clinic, hyperventilating, entirely consumed by a full-blown panic attack.
Right, after visiting a prostitute?
Yeah. He had visited a prostitute, and immediately afterward, he went to the bathroom and washed his genitals with cold water and soap.
And here's where basic biology intersects with profound psychological terror. The natural, involuntary physiological reaction to a sudden drop in temperature is for the cremaster muscle to violently contract, pulling the testicles and penis closer to the core of the body to preserve heat.
Shrinkage, basically.
Yes, but because his mind was already primed with the guilt of the encounter and the deep-seated cultural anxiety surrounding his manhood, he misinterpreted a basic temperature reflex as a lethal biological betrayal.
He believed he was experiencing Koro. He truly believed his manhood was abandoning him and that death was imminent.
This all loops back to the fundamental reality that modern society desperately tries to ignore. The brain is actually the primary sexual organ. It controls the entire vascular network. And the tragic irony of this system is that the harder a man consciously tries to force his biology to match the myth of the unfailing phallus, the more he biologically guarantees his own failure.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy rooted entirely in neurochemistry. Let's look at how the brain actually processes this pressure. When a man experiences performance anxiety, when he feels he must perform to validate his masculinity or fears the humiliation of failure, his brain doesn't process that as a social inconvenience.
No.
It perceives it as a literal threat to his survival.
Exactly. The brain activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the ancient primal fight or flight response. The moment that threat is perceived, the brain floods the bloodstream with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol.
Getting ready for a fight.
And crucially, to prepare the body to either run for its life or fight to the death, the sympathetic nervous system actively constricts the blood vessels in the core of the body, actively shunting blood away from the digestive tract and the reproductive organs,
Pushing it out toward the major muscle groups in the arms and legs. So the brain essentially acts as a circuit breaker.
That's a great way to put it.
The moment you panic about the power going out, your brain trips the switch itself to protect the system.
Exactly. You need the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode, to achieve an erection. But the cultural expectation of dominant performance generates a massive stress response, overriding the parasympathetic system.
The mind physically prevents the relaxation of the smooth muscle tissue.
The fear of failure creates the exact biological failure the man is terrified of.
And this psychological minefield is further compounded by evolutionary behavioral drives, like the Coolidge effect.
Right, the Coolidge effect. This is the tension between what our biology wants and what our social institutions demand.
Because the Coolidge effect is an observed biological phenomenon in most mammalian species, where males exhibit renewed sexual interest whenever they are introduced to new, novel receptive females, even after they have reached sexual exhaustion with prior partners.
From an evolutionary standpoint, in a multi-mate system, a male who can continuously summon arousal for new genetic opportunities passes on more genes. Biology craves novelty.
But our modern societal structures, quite rightly, demand long-term monogamous partnership. And this creates a severe friction point. When the initial mystery of a new relationship fades, as it always does, arousal can naturally biologically drop.
It takes more psychological effort to achieve the necessary parasympathetic relaxation.
And if a man is totally uneducated about the systems governing his own body, he misinterprets that natural, predictable biological lull as a catastrophic failure of his manhood.
He thinks his phallic power is permanently broken. That triggers the anxiety, which triggers the adrenaline, which shunts the blood away, and the destructive cycle locks him in completely.
Because society largely ignores the psychological weight of this cultural symbol, and because we refuse to dismantle the myth of the immortal phallus, we don't look for psychological or systemic fixes. We look for mechanical fixes.
We turn to institutions.
We build massive, multi-billion-dollar medical complexes, trying to force the fragile biology to match the indestructible myth.
This raises an important question. What happens when modern medicine is drafted into the service of upholding a cultural illusion? If we look at the history of medical intervention in this space, it starts brutally.
Yeah, let's talk about the institutional layer.
For centuries, if the biological system was deemed problematic, rebellious, or socially inconvenient, the institutional solution was simply to bypass it entirely via castration.
We see this across massive historical empires. You have the court eunuchs in ancient China and the Ottoman Empire. Because their testicles were removed, their reproductive lineage was completely severed.
They could not start a dynasty.
Right. Therefore, the emperors trusted them with immense bureaucratic power because their loyalty could only be to the crown, not to their own future children.
And we see it weaponized in extreme religious contexts, too. In 18th and 19th century Russia, there was a radical Christian sect known as the Skopsi.
The Skopsi, yeah.
They interpreted the fall of man and original sin as literal sexual desire. To them, the reproductive organs were the keys to hell. So thousands of members voluntarily subjected themselves to brutal castrations to permanently bypass the biological system and secure spiritual purity.
We even saw institutions dictating castration for purely aesthetic reasons in the arts. The Catholic Church, for a long period, forbade women from singing in church choirs or on stage.
But they still needed those high soprano voices.
So the institution created the castrati. Young boys with beautiful voices were castrated before puberty. The lack of testosterone prevented their vocal cords from thickening and their larynxes from dropping, preserving a prepubescent vocal range in an adult male body.
Singers like Farinelli became absolute superstars in 18th century Europe. It was a bizarre, almost grotesque cultural obsession with engineering a kind of androgynous, artificial perfection, entirely orchestrated by institutional power overriding natural biology.
But as we reach the 20th century, the institutional goal radically shifts. We stop trying to bypass the system, and we become obsessed with trying to supercharge it. We enter the rejuvenation craze, which is honestly staggering to read about.
It shows how desperately men feared the natural loss of phallic power.
The desperation was palpable, and it drove some deeply flawed science. You had Eugen Steinek, an incredibly famous Viennese physiologist. Steinek believed you could trick the aging body into youth by manipulating the internal plumbing.
Right. He performed surgeries where he tied off the seminal ducts, the deferens of rats, and eventually human men.
But why did he think that would work? What was the logic, however flawed?
It was essentially a crude understanding of hydraulics. Steinek theorized that the testicles had two jobs, producing sperm and producing hormones. He believed that if you surgically blocked the exit for the sperm, the testicle would be forced to redirect all its metabolic energy into its secondary function.
Oh, wow.
He thought the factory would overproduce testosterone and flood it back into the bloodstream, essentially revitalizing the aging man.
And people bought into this entirely. We're not talking about fringe characters here. Sigmund Freud himself, the man who created castration anxiety, underwent the Steinek procedure.
The brilliant poet W.B. Yeats had it done too.
They were terrified of the waning of their biological systems and looked to the surgeon's knife to restore the myth.
And Steinek wasn't even the most extreme example. You had Charles Edouard Brown-Séquard, a highly respected 72-year-old neurologist. In 1889, he stood before the scientific community in Paris and announced that he had discovered the secret to renewed youth.
This part is wild.
He had been taking the testicles of young dogs and guinea pigs, physically crushing them up, extracting the fluids, and injecting this crude, unfiltered animal extract directly into his own veins.
Which sounds completely unhinged today.
It does, but he fervently claimed it restored his physical strength, his mental acuity, and his sexual vigor. It was almost certainly an intense placebo effect, but it birthed the entire modern field of endocrinology.
It was institutional science groping blindly in the dark, driven entirely by the terror of aging and the loss of vitality.
And it took nearly a century of blind stumbling, bizarre surgeries, and animal extracts to figure out the actual vascular mechanics of the system. Which brings us to the year 1980 and a French cardiovascular surgeon named Ronald Verreaux's.
Verreaux's discovery is one of the great paradigm-shifting accidents of medical history.
It really is. Up until 1980, the medical consensus was still largely confused about what actually caused an erection. Was it primarily blood flow? Was it a mystical vital force?
Right.
Verreaux was performing a relatively routine vascular surgery on a patient. During the procedure, he needed to dilate a blood vessel, so he reached for a drug called papaverine.
Papaverine is a smooth muscle relaxant derived from the poppy plant.
Exactly. But through a sheer stroke of luck or a slip of the hand, he accidentally injected the papaverine directly into the patient's penis instead of the intended surrounding vessel. The result was immediate. The patient developed a profound, rigid erection that lasted for hours, entirely independent of any sexual arousal or psychological state.
The ultimate proof of concept.
It proved definitively, once and for all, that an erection was a hydraulic event dictated by smooth muscle relaxation, and more importantly, that you could chemically induce that relaxation even if the brain was completely bypassed. It birthed the era of injection therapy, fundamentally changing neurology overnight.
But let's be honest, injecting a needle directly into that specific anatomy every time you want to be intimate is highly invasive and psychologically daunting.
Definitely.
So the medical institution kept innovating, searching for less terrifying mechanical ways to sustain the phallic illusion. They brought in vacuum pumps.
Yes, the attempt to force biology through sheer physics. The source text talks about the Zabludowski pump, an early mechanical intervention. It was essentially a heavy glass or plastic cylinder placed over the organ.
And it required creating an immense amount of negative pressure.
The patient had to pump the device to create an underpressure of 200 millibars. To put that in perspective, that is significantly more pressure than is naturally generated inside a healthy, naturally erect penis.
Ouch.
It literally dragged blood into the spongy tissue by force. And once the tissue was engorged, the man had to quickly roll a tight, restrictive rubber ring over the base to act as a tourniquet and trap the blood there.
It was clumsy, uncomfortable, and entirely devoid of natural neurological response.
So they moved from external physics to internal architecture, surgical prostheses.
Right, where urologists began physically hollowing out the delicate corpora cavernosa and implanting inflatable silicone cylinders inside the tissue. The engineering was remarkably complex.
A man would have a tiny manual pump hidden inside his scrotum, connected via hidden tubes to a fluid reservoir implanted deep in his abdomen.
When he wanted an erection, he would manually squeeze the pump in his scrotum a few times, transferring the fluid from the abdomen into the silicone cylinders, creating a rigid mechanical erection.
But even then, you can't completely fake biology. The text mentions this resulted in what doctors morbidly called the Concorde phenomenon.
The Concorde phenomenon.
Right, because the silicone cylinders only stiffen the main shaft of the penis. The intricate vascular network of the glands, the head of the penis, remained completely disconnected from the process.
Oh, right. Since there was no natural systemic blood flow or neurological arousal occurring, the glands remained soft and drooped downward.
Resembling the drooping nose cone of the supersonic Concorde jet, it was a purely structural imitation of nature that completely failed to replicate the biological reality.
And then, after centuries of tying off rat ducts, crushing dog testicles, using glass vacuum tubes, and implanting silicone cylinders, the Holy Grail finally arrives.
The PDE5 inhibitors, the era of Viagra.
The introduction of sildenafil in the late 1990s changed the entire global landscape of masculinity. It was elegant because it didn't force an erection like a vacuum pump or a direct injection.
Yeah.
Instead, it subtly manipulated the internal enzymatic breakdown process.
Let's talk about how it actually works on a systemic level.
Yeah, explain the chemistry.
When a man is aroused, his brain sends the parasympathetic signal that releases a molecule called CGMP. That CGMP is the chemical messenger that tells the smooth muscles to relax and let the blood in.
Okay, the green light.
But the body has a built-in cleanup crew, an enzyme called PDE5. The job of PDE5 is to quickly break down the CGMP, ending the relaxation and ending the erection so the body can return to its tense baseline state.
It prevents the system from overloading.
Exactly. Viagra simply blocks the PDE5 enzyme. It handcuffs the cleanup crew. By stopping the breakdown of CGMP, the drug allows the relaxation signal to accumulate and persist far longer than it naturally would.
Wow.
It chemically enforces the muscle relaxation that the man's anxious, adrenaline-flooded brain might be desperately trying to override.
It is treating the absolute final symptom of the anxiety. It doesn't cure the psychological terror. It just chemically forces the blood vessels to ignore it. I always think about the quote from the actor Jack Nicholson that Van Driel includes in the source material.
Oh, that's a great quote.
Nicholson said that Viagra wasn't just about the physical mechanics of sex for him. He said that if he had possessed a pill like that in his youth, he would never have left several of his past relationships. He viewed the drug as a tool to navigate the crushing emotional and relational weight of performance.
The pill allowed him to perform without the paralyzing fear of failure, without feeling like he was shattering his partner's perception of his manhood.
It feels exactly like a mechanic treating a blinking check engine light by simply putting a piece of black tape over the dashboard instead of looking at the engine itself. We have built an entire multi-billion-dollar industry that treats the symptoms of this biological clash, but completely ignores the underlying pressure.
And that profound quote speaks perfectly to how modern medicine has effectively medicalized natural aging. Because we demand that men embody the immortal phallus, we cannot accept natural biological decline. We now have clinical terms like PADAM partial androgen deficiency in the aging male.
We've turned getting older into an acronym.
We treat the natural, gradual loss of vascular elasticity and the slow, completely normal decline of testosterone as a disease that must be aggressively cured. We pathologize normal, healthy human biology simply to uphold the cultural myth that a man must always be ready, always be rigid, and always be dominant.
And this institutional intervention reaches its absolute mind-bending zenith when we look at reproduction itself.
Yeah.
Look at the technology of ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection.
Let's break this down because it fundamentally alters the trajectory of our species.
Right?
ICSI is an incredible, miraculous technology for families struggling with severe infertility. A clinical analyst looks through a high-powered microscope at a sample of semen. They bypass the millions of struggling, immotile, or malformed sperm.
Okay.
They select a single, relatively healthy-looking sperm cell, pick it up with a microscopic glass pipette, and physically pierce the outer shell of an extracted female ovum, injecting the genetic material directly inside.
It completely 100% bypasses Darwinian natural selection. For literally millions of years, the entire architecture of the male reproductive system, the massive volume, the complex fluid chemistry, the fragile temperature control, was built specifically to win a mass race of millions of sperm cells through an incredibly hostile environment.
Right.
Only the absolute strongest, most chemically viable sperm ever reached the egg, and ICSI just skips the entire race.
It skips the race, it skips the female's evolutionary defenses against poor genetic material, and it completely decouples reproduction from both physical performance and evolutionary fitness.
It is an incredible medical triumph for the individual, but systemically, on an evolutionary scale, it is a profound, unprecedented shortcut.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed through an immense amount of history in biology today. We've gone from ancient Romans swearing oaths on their testicles to Greeks worshipping giant stone pillars while tying ribbons around their own anatomy. We've looked at the terrifying psychological loop of Cora syndrome, the desperate animal injections of the 19th century, and the microscopic pipettes of modern fertility clinics. Let's synthesize these systems and put it all together.
When we step back and view this through the lens of a systems analysis, the core truth becomes undeniable. Manhood, as we culturally define it, is an emergent property.
It is the unstable result of four overlapping, deeply contradictory systems. First, you have the biological system, which we now know is incredibly fragile, highly competitive, heavily reliant on temperature regulation, and ultimately mortal and prone to failure.
Second, you have the cultural system. Built around the mythology of the phallus, this system demands an organ that is immortal, always strong, always dominant, and entirely unfailing.
The biological reality of surrender and relaxation is completely at odds with the cultural expectation of rigid power.
Exactly. And the violent friction between those two opposing systems creates the third layer, the psychological system. This manifests as a devastating feedback loop of performance anxiety, fear of failure, and chronic stress.
This psychological terror triggers the sympathetic nervous system, physically disabling the biological system's ability to relax, creating the exact failure the culture condemns.
Finally, because we refuse to tear down the cultural myth and accept our own biological vulnerability, we rely on the fourth layer, the institutional system. We use modern medicine, pharmaceuticals, and high-tech urology to artificially bridge the gap.
We use vacuum pumps, PDE5 inhibitors, and microscopic pipettes to violently force the moral failing biology to mimic the immortal, unyielding symbol. We are patching the cracks in the stone statue with chemicals and glass tubes.
Which brings us back to the premise of our show. The real crisis in perception here is that we are a society that insists on reading the murky, chaotic, fragile, muddy waters of human biology as if it were a clean, binary black and white X-ray. We expect our soft, mortal bodies to behave exactly like the symbols we carve into stone.
It's an impossible standard.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative thought, something to really chew on and explore long after this session ends. We talked about how millions of years of brutal, unyielding sperm competition shaped the physical reality of the male body. But if modern institutional technology like ICSI completely removes the need for that microscopic biological race,
and if chemical interventions like PDE5 inhibitors completely remove the psychological need for the brain to relax in order to achieve intimacy,
what happens to human evolution over the next 10,000 years? If we use our institutions to completely decouple the biological act of reproduction from the physical and psychological act of sex, will the cultural symbol of the phallus eventually lose its power entirely?
1,000 years from now, will future generations look back at our civilization's absolute obsession with manhood, performance, and phallic dominance as just a bizarre, highly stressful, and medically expensive historical quirk?
It's a profound question. When you use technology to fundamentally alter the systems that shape the biology, the cultural meaning inevitably, eventually, has to shift to catch up.
The statues will eventually crumble.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief, and how stepping back to look at the whole machine gives us the tools to see the world and our own bodies more clearly.
And this project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind our systems-level analyses, you can become a supporter on our Patreon.
We also have a visual mini-explainer of today's complex biological mechanics linked in the description. If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with what books, myths, or topics you'd like us to unpack next. Because until we realize that the X-ray machine is broken, we're going to keep misdiagnosing the problem. See you next time.